I knew, my son said, 34 years old and crying into a phone from 4,000 miles away. I knew everything, Dad. I didn't answer right away. I have spent 40 years learning that a clock never lies about the moment it breaks. It lies about every moment before that, and I wanted to hear exactly how far back his lying went before I said a single word back to him. Since when? I finally asked. Almost from the start, he said. Close enough to it that pretending otherwise would just be one more lie on top of everything else. Dad, please say something. I thought about a night in my own shop 40-some years earlier, waiting for my own father to say something after a mistake of my own, and how long that silence had gone on. I wasn't ready yet to decide whether I was about to repeat it or finally do something different with it. I know, son, I said finally. I know everything. That call came 2 weeks after a text message first arrived on my shop counter at 5:52 in the morning. 4 words long, and it will make more sense if I start there. Instead, with the morning, I still believed I only had a family disagreement on my hands, not a case. 8 days after that text message, Vincent Okafor turned his monitor toward me at 10 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning, and there it was, in black and white. Petition for emergency guardianship and declaration of incapacity. Petitioner Porter Hartsfeld. Respondent Ezekiel Hartsfeld. Read it, Vince said. All of it, don't skim. I read it twice. Attached medical evaluation. Progressive cognitive decline. Impaired financial judgment. Signed by a Dr. Neil Bramwell. A name I recognized from exactly one visit, 11 minutes long, about a prescription refill for my blood pressure medication. He filed this 5 days ago, Vince said. Before your son ever texted you about the trip. 5 days. Ezekiel, listen to me. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. Somebody built a case. Somebody assembled a doctor, a timeline, and a filing date, and did it before the first shot was even fired at you directly. What does the medical section say exactly? Evaluation dated September 29th. Diagnosis of moderate cognitive impairment based on clinical observation and family-reported symptoms. I saw Bramwell in July. For a refill. 11 minutes. There's no record of a September appointment anywhere in his office system. I already checked. Either way, it's attached to a request to freeze every account with your name on it, effective the moment a judge signs. I set the papers down on his desk, squared the edges without meaning to. 40 years of handling contracts had made that automatic. Who does the county call when a competency claim needs independent verification? I asked. Who's on that list? Vince looked up at me over his glasses. You know who. Say it anyway. You are Ezekiel. You've been on that list 9 years. 14 cases, every one of them held up on appeal. And the withdrawals? Vince asked, though I hadn't yet told him about those. He must have seen something in my face already, answering the question before I did. Separate matter, I said. I only found those this morning before I drove here. We'll get to it, one document at a time. He tapped the petition once with 2 fingers. This is the one trying to move fastest. This is the one we answer first. What happens if I do nothing about it? I asked. Then, in 11 days, a judge who's never met you signs an order transferring financial and medical authority to Porter. Every account freezes the same day. Your name comes off the deed within 30 days after that. You'd have no legal standing to object to any of it because a person declared incompetent has no standing to object to anything. And if I do something, Vince finally smiled the way he used to smile across a negotiating table 30 years ago. Then we let the county do what it already does better than either of us. We let them call their own examiner. Me. You. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Vince picked up his phone to message the clerk's office, and I sat there thinking about the 8 days that had led to this chair, this document, with my name under the wrong heading. 8 days earlier, I was in the shop at 5 in the morning, the way I had been every morning since Corinne died. The calendar behind the register still had October 14th circled in red pen, the date our flight to Frankfurt was supposed to leave, connecting on to Triberg, the town where her grandfather had apprenticed as a clockmaker before he emigrated. I had booked the trip 11 months earlier, 2 business-class seats, a private tour of the Uhren Museum I'd promised her for 30 years and never delivered. So I was going to deliver it now, for both of us, alone. I had also 3 weeks before left Porter a voicemail asking if he wanted the 2 Rourke pocket watches from the display case. The ones his great-great-grandfather had made in Triberg before the family crossed the Atlantic. He never called back. I told myself he was busy with the cider house. On the wall behind my workbench hung a mantel clock with no hands. It had sat there 4 years waiting for a customer named Alden Rourke to collect it, which he never did, after his divorce settled and the matching grandfather clock went to his ex-wife instead. I keep unclaimed work exactly as the customer left it. Some debts you simply carry until someone comes to collect. At 5:52, my phone buzzed on the counter. Porter Hartsfeld. Dad, plans changed. You're not coming. 4 words to open it. Then a second message sent 9 seconds later. Petra thinks it's better if it's just her family this time. Sorry. I read it once. Then I read it a second time, the way I read every hairspring twice, before deciding whether it's actually bent or only looks bent under bad light. I set the phone face up on the counter and looked at it the way I would look at a part that had failed a customer's watch, not with anger, yet only with the question of exactly where along the mechanism the failure had started. The phone buzzed again before I had decided on an answer. It was not a text this time. It was a call. Porter's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I picked it up, and the voice on the other end was not my son's. Hello, Ezekiel. Not Dad. Not even Mr. Hartsfeld, just my name, flat and pleasant, the way a receptionist says a name off a chart. Petra. Where's Porter? He's finishing a call with our distributor. I picked up because I didn't want you sitting with that text for the next hour wondering what it meant. It meant 4 words. I read English. A small laugh, the kind rehearsed for customers who complain. I know this feels sudden. It isn't really. Porter and I talked about it for weeks. We just didn't want to bring it up until the details were settled. Weeks. The trip is a lot, Ezekiel. 2 flights, a 5-hour drive from Frankfurt, then walking tours every day in a town with cobblestone streets. At your age, that's a real physical strain, even if you don't feel it yet. I feel fine. Of course you do. That's exactly the problem with these things. You don't feel it until you're already overextended. We looked into it, actually. Porter's cousin is a physical therapist. She said falls on uneven pavement are the single biggest cause of hospitalization for men your age traveling abroad. I've walked cobblestone before, Petra. I was born walking it. I know. I just want you safe. That's all this is. I said nothing for a moment, and she filled the silence the way people do when they've decided silence means they're winning. We'll get you the full itinerary when we're back, she said. Every stop, photos, video, the museum tour, all of it. You'll feel like you were there without any of the risk. You booked a private tour of a clock museum for a woman who's never asked me a single question about a clock in 4 years of marriage? I know it means a lot to you. That's exactly why Porter wants to do it right now. Take his time, not rush through it, worried about you keeping up. Put my name back on the reservation, Petra. Her voice didn't change pace at all. I really think this is the healthier choice for everyone. You'll thank us. Put it back. I have to go. We're finalizing ground transportation with the concierge, and there's a pre-auth hold on the card that needs sorting before it clears. I stopped squaring the papers in front of me. A what? A pre-authorization hold. On the deposit. It's a banking term. Don't worry about it. I've run a business for 40 years, Petra. I know what a pre-authorization hold is. I've just never heard a woman who sells skincare and vacation photographs for a living use it without stopping to think about it first. The pause on her end lasted exactly long enough for me to count it. 1 second. 2. I used to work adjacent to healthcare billing, she said. Insurance terminology bleeds into everything eventually. Which office? Ezekiel, I really do have to go. Which office, Petra? The line went dead. Not a goodbye, not a click of courtesy, just the flat tone of a call ended from the other side. The way you'd hang up on a wrong number. Except she wasn't the one who'd been wronged. I set the phone down on the counter and looked at the register calendar again. October 14th circled in red. I only knew then that a woman who filmed herself applying sunscreen for a living had just used the phrase pre-authorization hold, the way a person uses a word they've typed 1,000 times and never once had to explain. Adjacent to healthcare billing wasn't a lie built on nothing. It was a lie built on almost nothing, which is worse because almost nothing still leaves a shape behind. I've spent 4 decades restoring movements where a previous repairman tried to hide a crack in the mainspring barrel with solder instead of a replacement part. The solder always shows eventually under the loop. You just have to know to look. I didn't call Porter back. I didn't call Vince yet either. I walked instead to the small roll-top desk in the back of the shop, the one that had been my father's, and opened the laptop I mostly used for supplier invoices and county case files. I wasn't going to trust anything Petra had told me. I was going to check it. The travel agency's confirmation email was easy enough to find. I had every message from the last 11 months filed by date, the same way I file invoices, a habit Corinne used to tease me about, right up until the year she got sick. And every one of those files turned out to matter. I opened the booking. 2 business-class seats Frankfurt connecting to a regional flight into the Black Forest. Confirmation number, deposit paid balance paid in full, March of that year. Then, near the bottom, a line I hadn't clicked on before because I'd had no reason to. Modification history. I clicked it anyway. Request submitted, remove passenger 2 Ezekiel Hartzfeld. Submitted by Porter Hartzfeld, authorized account holder. Timestamp 6 days before this morning. 6 days. Porter's text had come in that morning. The email said 6 days. I checked the math twice the way I check a client's manifest twice before I sign off on a valuation. The cancellation request predated the text by 5 full days. Whatever had happened between Petra and Porter to produce the words "you're not coming" had actually happened almost a week earlier, and neither of them had said a word to me in all that time. They had let me keep planning, keep checking flight times, keep leaving voicemails about pocket watches, while the seat itself had already been pulled out from under me in some travel agency's back-end system. That wasn't a decision made in a hard conversation last night. That was a decision made then, sat on, then delivered on a schedule that suited someone else. I closed the laptop. There is a rule I teach every apprentice who comes through this shop. The same rule my father taught me on this same bench 40-some years ago. You never trust the hands of a clock to tell you the truth. You trust the escapement. The hands are just what the mechanism decided to show you after the fact, once it had already made up its mind. Porter's text had been the hands. The confirmation email was the escapement. The phone buzzed again on the counter. And for a moment I thought it might be Porter finally calling for himself, instead of letting his wife speak for him. It wasn't a phone call. It was a bank alert. Joint emergency account withdrawal notice, $9,800, timestamp 2 days ago. I hadn't withdrawn anything from that account in 11 years. I opened the banking app and scrolled to the transaction. Branch location Hood River, Main Street, 4 blocks from the shop. Withdrawal method in-person teller-assisted. Authorized signer Porter Hartzfeld. $9,800 in cash over the counter at a branch 4 blocks from where I was standing, and I hadn't heard a word about it. Corinne had opened that account the year Porter turned 25. Both our names on the paperwork. Her handwriting steady across the signature line. For emergencies. Not a truck, not a wedding. The day something actually goes wrong and he needs cash before a bank can process anything else. Nothing had gone wrong. No accident, no hospital, no call in the night. Just a withdrawal 2 days old, sitting quietly in an account neither of us had touched since she died. I thought about calling the bank. I thought about calling Porter instead and asking him plainly why $9,800 of his mother's emergency money had left that account without either of us discussing it. I did neither. I sat at my father's roll-top desk with the laptop open and the shop quiet around me, and I did what I have always done when a mechanism shows me a fault I don't yet understand. I started looking for the next one. The second withdrawal was easier to find than the first because by then I knew what I was looking for. $9,800. Different branch, same bank, 3 days before the first one. Same authorized signer. Same method in-person teller-assisted cash. I sat back from the laptop, and did the arithmetic the way I check a movement's beat rate before I ever touch the regulator. 2 withdrawals, $19,600 total, both exactly $200 under $10,000. I knew that number. Anyone who has run a business long enough knows that number. $10,000 is the line a bank has to report to the federal government without being asked. Cross it once, even by $1, and the transaction gets flagged automatically. Stay under it, and nothing gets reported at all, unless someone downstream notices the pattern of staying under it again and again at different branches spaced a few days apart. That wasn't carelessness. Carelessness doesn't know where the line is. This knew exactly where the line was and walked right up beside it twice. I scrolled further back through the account history. 3 months, then 6. Looking for a third withdrawal because 2 is a coincidence and 3 is a decision. I found it on the second scroll. 8 days before the first one. $9,800. A third branch this one, across the river in White Salmon. 3 withdrawals. 3 branches. $29,400, all under Corinne's emergency account. All authorized by Porter. None of it ever mentioned to me. Before I called Vince, I called the Hood River branch directly. I've banked there 30 years. The manager, Delphine Aoki, took over from her father the same year I took over this shop from mine. Ezekiel, she said, you're up early. I need to ask you something about an account, and I need you to tell me honestly whether you can answer it. Depends on the question. The joint emergency account. Corinne's account. Was there a withdrawal processed at your branch 9 days ago? A pause, the sound of a keyboard. I can confirm a transaction occurred. I can't discuss specifics with you over the phone unless you're the primary holder, requesting your own account activity, which you are, so yes. 9,800 cash teller assisted. Who authorized it? Porter. He had ID, he's on the account, everything cleared. Did he say what it was for? Ezekiel people don't have to tell us what $9,000 is for. We just have to confirm they're allowed to take it. I understand. Thank you, Delphine. Is everything all right? I'll know better in about an hour, I said, and hung up before she could ask a second question I didn't yet have an answer for. I picked up the phone and called Vince before I'd fully decided what I was going to say to him. He answered on the second ring. Ezekiel, it's early for you to be calling. I need to see you today. I've got a closing at 11, but I can move some things. What's going on? Porter's wife called me this morning and told me I'm not going on the trip to Germany. Said it was for my own health. That's not why you're calling me at 6:30. No, I said. I found 3 withdrawals from the emergency account Corinne set up for him. 9,800 each. 3 different branches over the last 2 weeks. There was a pause on his end, the kind I recognized because I've made that same pause myself over a client's ledger, right before I tell them the number they've been avoiding. Say the amount again, Vince said. 9,800. Each time. Ezekiel, that's not an accident. Nobody withdraws that specific number by accident 3 times at 3 locations. That's structuring. That's deliberately staying under the reporting threshold so the bank doesn't flag it to the Treasury. I know what it is. I wanted to hear you say it before I said it myself. Do you have the statements pulled? I have screenshots of all 3. Bring them. Don't call Porter first, don't call the bank first, don't do anything except bring me those screenshots. I want to see the account agreement too. Whose names are on it, what the withdrawal limits are supposed to be, everything. I can be there in 20 minutes. Make it 9 o'clock. I need to make a call first, and you need coffee before you sit across from me with this. Vince. Just tell me now, is this about the trip or something worse? It's not about the trip anymore, he said. It hasn't been about the trip since about 6 this morning, when a clerk I know called me at home before I'd even opened the office. I didn't tell him I hadn't slept the amount that would require coffee to fix. I hung up, gathered the printed statements from the small filing cabinet beside the roll-top desk I still print everything, a habit from before digital records were trusted in this county's courts, and locked the shop's front door at 6:40, 40 minutes earlier than I have opened for customers in 11 straight years. The drive to Vince's office takes 14 minutes along the river road past the Orchard Co-op and the old railroad depot converted into a tasting room. though I couldn't tell you a single thing I saw out the windshield that morning. I was still running the numbers. $29,400 structured to avoid detection, pulled from an account meant for the one kind of emergency that had never actually happened. Corinne had made me promise the year we opened that account that I would never touch it out of pride, and never let Porter touch it out of convenience. Watch it like you'd watch a mainspring under tension, she'd said. It looks like nothing's happening right up until it lets go all at once. I hadn't understood the comparison then. I understood it perfectly by the time I reached the courthouse square. I parked outside Vince's building at 8:51. He met me at the door before I'd finished locking the truck, already holding 2 cups of coffee, and he didn't say good morning. He said, "There's something else you need to see first, before we even get to the withdrawals." And I followed him inside, not knowing that the next document he put in front of me would have my own name on the wrong side of it. That morning in Vince's office ended the way I've already told you it ended. My name under the word respondent, the county's own list, with my signature on it 9 years running. Vince already texting the clerk before I'd finished absorbing what I was looking at. What I haven't told you yet is what happened after he set the phone down. "There's a piece missing," Vince said. "The petition names a diagnosis, a date, and a doctor. It doesn't name who actually typed the report. Medical evaluations don't write themselves, Ezekiel, and Bramwell's office has no record of examining you. So somebody produced a document with his name on it, and either he signed something he shouldn't have, or somebody signed it for him. Can you find out which?" "Not by myself. I need someone who can read a digital file the way you read a movement who touched it. When what was changed, and when it was changed. I know someone." He picked up his desk phone instead of his cell, which told me before he said anything that this was a call he didn't want on record anywhere convenient. "Gideon, it's Vince Okafor. I've got a forensic document question for you, and I need it fast." I'd never met Gideon Marsh, but I'd heard the name twice before, both times from other business owners in the valley. Both times in the tone people use for a man they're relieved is on their side and grateful never to need. Independent forensic accountant. Worked corporate fraud cases before he moved out to Hood River to slow down. Except slowing down for Gideon apparently still meant a full caseload and a habit of answering his phone before the second ring. Vince put him on speaker. "Send me what you've got," Gideon said, no greeting, just the sound of a keyboard already moving. "Petition medical exhibit and anything with a timestamp on it. I want metadata, not just the printed page." "I'll have Ezekiel bring copies within the hour," Vince said. "Ezekiel Hartsfeld, the clockman." "That's me," I said. "You did the county's valuation on the Kessling estate 2 years back. Good work. Fast, and you didn't pad the report to justify your fee, which is rarer than it should be." A pause, keys still going. "Tell me what you know so far." I told him what I knew. The withdrawal pattern. The filing date that predated the confrontation by 5 days. The evaluation dated September 29th, a day I could account for with a receipt from my own supplier 100 miles from Bramwell's office. "That last part is useful," Gideon said. "If you can prove you weren't even in the county on the date of the supposed exam, that's not just suspicious anymore. That's a document built around a date nobody checked. How long to trace who built it? Depends what format they used. If it's a PDF exported from a clinic's record system, there's a decent chance the metadata survived author field last modified by, sometimes even the login session. People who fake documents for a living know to scrub that. People who fake one document once usually don't. You think this was a first attempt? I think most people who do this kind of thing don't get caught the first time, because they've done it before and learned what not to leave behind," Gideon said. "The mistakes in this file will tell us if this was practiced or improvised. Bring me the exhibit. I'll know something by tonight." Vince walked me out to the truck himself, which he doesn't usually do, and stood in the parking lot a moment longer than the conversation required. "There's something you should prepare yourself for," he said. "Say it." "If Gideon finds what I think he's going to find, it isn't going to point at a stranger. Falsifying a specific medical exhibit with a specific date time to a specific filing that's not the work of someone outside your family who doesn't know your calendar. That's someone who had access to both. The paperwork and your life. I thought about Petra's voice on the phone that morning. The ease with which the word pre-authorization had come out of her. The way she'd corrected herself half a second too late. I didn't say her name to Vince yet. I wanted Gideon's answer first. The way I never tell a customer what's wrong with their watch until I've actually opened the case back and looked. Send him the file, I said. I'll drive it over myself. Gideon's office turned out to be a converted garage behind his house on the ridge above the Fruit Loop. 2 monitors and a filing cabinet and a coffee maker that looked older than his laptop. He met me at the door in reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and didn't bother with a handshake before waving me toward a stool at his workbench, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. I don't shake hands over unfinished business either. Give me the exhibit, he said. I handed him the flash drive Vince had prepared. Gideon plugged it in without sitting down, scrolling through something on the screen faster than I could follow, muttering numbers to himself, the way I mutter beat rates when I'm listening to a movement through a loop. Author field's been stripped, he said after a minute. Somebody knew to do that much. But whoever exported this used the clinic's internal template, I can tell by the header formatting. The exact margin the software defaults to. That template isn't public. You can't download it. You have to be inside the system to pull a blank one. So it came from inside Bramwell's office. It came from inside the software Bramwell's office uses, which isn't quite the same thing. Could be him. Could be anyone with login access, a nurse, a scheduler, a records clerk. I'll know more once I cross-reference the font kerning against known exports from that same practice management system. Different versions render slightly differently. It's tedious, and it's the kind of tedious that actually holds up in front of a judge. How long? Tonight, like I said. Maybe tomorrow morning if the software version is older than I'm hoping. He looked up at me for the first time since I'd sat down. You want my honest read before I've finished the technical part? That's why I drove out here instead of waiting for a phone call. My honest read is that whoever built this wasn't sloppy. They were careful about the parts that matter to a casual reader. The diagnosis language sounds right. The date sequence is internally consistent. The signature block is formatted correctly. They just didn't think anyone would go looking at the file the way I'm about to go looking at it. That's not stupidity. That's overconfidence. Those aren't the same failure, but they end the same way. I drove back down the ridge with the windows cracked. The smell of the orchards thick enough to taste. And I thought about the word overconfidence the entire way. It fit. It fit Petra's voice on the phone that morning, the ease of a woman explaining a lie she'd told herself so many times it had started to feel true in her own mouth. Gideon called at 9:40 that night, not the following morning, which told me something before he'd said a single word. He'd found what he needed faster than he expected, and he hadn't wanted to sit on it. I've got it, he said. You should probably be sitting down, though. I suspect you already are. Because I understand sitting down isn't really your style, even when it would help. Just say it, Gideon. The practice management software Bramwell's office runs is 4 versions behind current. I told you that mattered. Older versions log session activity in a way the newer ones scrub automatically for privacy compliance. Which means whoever exported this file left a trail they didn't know still existed. And the trail says what? The document was generated at 11:47 at night 3 weeks before the filing date. The clinic closes at 5. Nobody sees patients at 11:47 at night. But somebody logged into the record system at that hour using an active staff credential and pulled a blank evaluation template and exported it 11 minutes later with a diagnosis, a date, and Bramwell's digital signature stamp attached. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and said nothing because I already knew where this was going. And I wanted to hear him say the name before I let myself believe it. Whose credential? P. Calloway, Records and Billing Coordinator. Employment dates run from 4 years ago through this past February when the account shows as deactivated, except it wasn't actually deactivated. It was just flagged inactive in the newer scheduling module, while the older records export function, the one nobody bothered to fully retire, kept the login live in the background. A gap in their transition to the new system. The kind of gap that exists in almost every small practice that's ever switched software and nobody wanted to pay a consultant to do it properly. Calloway, I said. That's Petra's maiden name. I assumed as much, given what you told me about her. I don't know your family well enough to confirm it myself, but the timing lines up with what you described. She left that job around the time she started doing the sponsorship work full-time. People don't always think to have their old employer revoke system access the day they walk out the door, especially somewhere small, especially somewhere that trusted them. I sat down at the kitchen table, across from Corinne's empty chair, the way I do most nights now, without deciding to, and I thought about the word trusted, and how strange it was to hear it applied to Petra by a man who'd never met her. 4 years, Gideon had said. Petra had worked in that clinic for 4 years before she ever met Porter filing insurance claims and scheduling appointments, and learning, presumably without meaning to at the time, exactly how a medical record moves through a system, exactly which fields a doctor never actually looks at himself, exactly what a form needs to contain to be believed by anyone who isn't looking closely. She hadn't built that knowledge for this. She'd built it doing ordinary work, the kind nobody thinks to be suspicious of, and then one night, 3 weeks before a filing date, she'd picked up a tool she already understood better than anyone watching her would have guessed. I thought of my own apprenticeship, 40-some years back, learning to true a balance wheel under my father's eye, not knowing yet that the same steady hand that could true a wheel could also, in the wrong use, be steady enough to file down a serial number until nobody could prove which watch it had come from. A skill doesn't care what it's used for. It just waits to be pointed somewhere. Bramwell didn't write it, I said. It wasn't a question by the time it left my mouth. Bramwell's signature stamp is a digital asset stored in the software itself, applied automatically to any document generated under his provider number. He doesn't have to physically sign anything for his name to end up on a form. If Petra still had access to pull a blank template and fill it out herself, the system would attach his stamp without him ever seeing the document at all. So he might not know. He might not know, Gideon agreed. Which is worth finding out directly and soon, because if he does know, that changes what we're dealing with considerably. And if he doesn't know, he's about to find out his name was used to help commit elder financial fraud, and men in his position tend to want to get ahead of that news, rather than be surprised by it in a courtroom. I thanked him, told him I'd have Vince handle whatever paperwork made this admissible, and sat at the table a long while after we hung up the kitchen. Quiet, except for the clock above the stove, the one Corinne had bought at an estate sale in the Dalles, because she liked the sound of it secondhand better than any of the ones I made for a living. I didn't call Porter that night either. I told myself it was because I wanted the full picture before I spoke to him, that a half-finished investigation wasn't fair to bring to my own son. The truer reason was simpler. I didn't yet trust myself to make the call, and not say something I couldn't take back before I had all the facts in hand. I called Bramwell's office first thing the next morning before they officially opened, and got the answering service instead. I left my name and asked for a callback, and I was still standing at the counter with a cup of coffee going cold when the shop phone rang 11 minutes later. Faster than any doctor's office had ever called me back in my life, which told me the message had already reached him some other way. Or he'd been waiting for exactly this call without knowing it was coming. Mr. Hartsfeld, he said, his voice tight in a way I recognized from 30 years of watching nervous customers try to explain why they'd waited 2 years to bring in a broken watch. I understand you have some questions about your file. I have questions about a file with your name on it, I said. I never sat in your office for the exam it describes. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I knew before he said another word that whatever came next was going to confirm exactly what Gideon had found. I never examined you, Mr. Hartsfeld, Bramwell said finally. I want to say that plainly before anything else. Whatever is in that file, I did not sit across from you and form that opinion. I would remember. I've been in this valley 26 years. I know most of my patients by the sound of their voice on the phone. Then explain the signature. The system attaches it automatically. Any document generated under my provider number in that software carries my digital stamp whether I've touched it or not. It's meant to save time on routine paperwork. I never imagined it would be used this way. Someone used a login that belonged to a former employee of yours. A records and billing coordinator. Left your practice this past February. There was a pause long enough that I could hear a door close somewhere behind him. Someone else in the office being asked to step out. Petra, he said. It wasn't a question. You remember her. 4 years, Mr. Hartsfeld. She ran that side of the office better than the 2 people before her combined. I trusted her with things I probably shouldn't have trusted anyone with. Password resets, template access, patient scheduling overrides. When she left, I asked our office manager to close out her accounts. I assumed it was done. I didn't check. It wasn't done. No, he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly. Not from fear of what this meant for him, or not only that. She used to talk about your son. Proudly. She'd show people photos on her phone during lunch. The cider house, the 2 of them at some vineyard event. I liked her. I want you to understand that isn't an excuse, it's just true, and it makes this worse, not better. I'm not asking you to feel worse, Dr. Bramwell. I'm asking what you're willing to do about it. Whatever your attorney needs. A sworn statement, records confirming there's no visit on file for the date in question. I'll report the access gap to the medical board myself today before anyone asks me to. I should have closed that gap in February. That's on me, whatever else is true about who walked through it. I believed him, which surprised me a little. Sitting there with the shop phone against my ear and the register calendar still showing October 14th circled in red. I have spent 4 decades learning to tell the difference between a customer covering for their own mistake and a customer genuinely blindsided by someone else's. Bramwell had the second sound. Tired, ashamed, but not evasive. A man discovering a door he thought was locked had been standing open for months. Send everything to Vincent Okafor, I said, and gave him the number. Today, if you can manage it. I can have it to him within the hour. I thanked him and ended the call, and stood at the counter a while longer than I needed to. Turning the whole shape of it over, the way I'd turn a movement under the loop looking for the part I might still be missing. Petra hadn't acted alone. In the sense that mattered, least she hadn't needed an accomplice to walk into a record system she still had keys to. But she had needed somewhere to walk into. And Bramwell's unclosed account had been exactly that. A door nobody remembered to lock because nobody imagined the person who'd once earned that trust would ever use it this way. I thought about my own shop, my own doors, the display case in the back room where 3 generations of Hartsfeld work sat behind a lock I hadn't changed in 11 years. Porter still had a key. He'd had one since he was 19, back when he used to open for me on Saturdays before school let out, for the cider apprenticeship instead. I hadn't thought about that key in years. I thought about it now, and I didn't like the direction the thought was heading, so I set it aside the way I set aside a hypothesis that isn't yet supported by anything but a bad feeling. Vince called back within the hour before I'd finished writing down everything Bramwell had told me. He's fast, Vince said. Sworn statements already in my inbox. Access log confirmation from the medical board complaint he filed himself, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. This is about as clean a piece of corroborating evidence as I've ever gotten from a hostile witness who isn't even hostile. He's not hostile. He's mortified. Good. Mortified people cooperate faster than defensive ones. Here's where we stand. I can file a formal response to the petition by tomorrow morning built entirely around 3 things: Bramwell's statement, Gideon's metadata trail, and the county's own examiner roster with your name already on it. That last piece alone should be enough for a judge to question why this filing exists at all. And the withdrawals? Separate track. Structuring is a federal matter, not a family court matter, but I can reference it in our response as evidence of a broader pattern, not just an isolated bad decision, but a coordinated effort. Judges pay attention to coordination. Isolated mistakes get sympathy, coordination gets scrutiny. Do it, I said. File whatever gets this in front of a judge fastest. There's one more thing, Vince said, his tone shifting slightly, the way it does right before he tells me something he'd rather not have to. I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is there anything else with your name on it that Porter has access to? Property accounts, inventory, anything that a judge might later ask why you didn't secure once you knew what you were dealing with. I thought about the display case. I thought about the key Porter had carried since he was 19. The one I'd never once considered taking back because taking it back had never seemed like something a father should have to do. "I'll look into it tonight," I said, and meant it, more seriously than I let my voice show. I locked the shop early again the second time in 3 days and drove home, telling myself I only wanted to review the inventory log before the day got any longer. That was true as far as it went. It wasn't the whole truth, and I have never much cared for half explanations, even the ones I offer myself in an empty kitchen with the porch light not yet on. I didn't open the display case that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the inventory ledger instead. The paper one Corinne had kept for me before I trusted anything to a screen. And I read down the list of what the case was supposed to hold, item by item, the way I'd read a client's manifest before agreeing to sign off on its accuracy. I made myself stop before I reached the third shelf. Not because I wasn't ready to know, because some counts deserve daylight and a clear head, not the end of a day that had already asked enough of me. Vince's response went into the court system at 8 the next morning, and he called me 20 minutes later to say a judge had already been assigned to review it. Judge Okonkwo Reyes, a name he said with the particular relief of a lawyer who's drawn someone known for reading the full file before a hearing instead of skimming it in the hallway. "She'll want a formal response from the other side within 5 business days, Vince said. "That's the earliest realistically this moves. I know that feels slow. It's not slow, it's a process. I understand process. I know you do. That's actually why I'm not worried about you sitting with this for 5 days. Most clients I'd be checking on daily. You I'm checking on because it's professionally required, not because I think you're going to do something rash." "Should I be worried you think I might?" "No," he said, and I could hear him almost smile through the phone. "I think you're going to do something extremely well organized instead, which honestly concerns me more." "What happens during the 5 days? Anything I should prepare for?" Porter's attorney, assuming he's retained one by now, which I'd assume, given what's already been filed, has that window to submit an answer to our response. They can concede, they can contest, or they can try to withdraw the petition entirely and hope the whole thing quietly disappears before a hearing date gets set. If I had to guess which one, given how thin their filing already looks next to what we've put in front of the judge, I'd guess withdrawal. Nobody wants a hearing when the other side has a forensic accountant, a cooperating physician, and a county examiner roster all pointing the same direction. And if they withdraw the petition, then the guardianship threat is over on paper, but nothing about the structuring or the falsified document goes away. Those are separate matters entirely, and neither one cares whether the family court case gets dropped. I was still standing at the counter turning that over when the shop phone rang again. A different call entirely. One I hadn't expected. "Ezekiel, it's Roy," Petra's brother. I'd met him twice. Once at Porter's wedding, once at a 4th of July cookout 2 summers back, where he'd spent most of the afternoon on his phone near the fence line, distracted in a way I'd chalked up at the time to a young man simply bored at an older crowd's party. Nothing more complicated than that. "Roy, this is a genuine surprise. What can I do for you?" This is going to sound strange, but I'm trying to get a read on shipping rates for some equipment, and Porter mentioned once that you used to deal with freight brokers back before you took over the shop full-time. I figured you'd know who's reliable out this way. It was a thin reason for a call thinner than it needed to be, if it were true. And I've spent enough years reading customers who lead with a small question to soften the ground for a bigger one, to recognize the shape of it. "I can certainly give you a name or two," I said. "What exactly are you shipping?" "Just some personal items, nothing major." A pause longer than the question warranted. "Look, I probably shouldn't have called. Petra would say this isn't my business to bring up." "Bring up what Roy—" Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped the casual register entirely. "Nothing. Forget I said anything. It's not I'm not part of whatever's actually going on between you and Porter. I just get told what I need to know when I need to know it, same as everybody else in that family. And sometimes that's less than I'd like." "That sounds like something worth saying a little more of, Roy, if you're willing." "It's not my place," he said quick now, the door already closing. "I really did just want the freight names. I've got a project I'm trying to get off the ground, and I don't want to keep asking Wyatt for help with everything." I gave him 2 names, real ones, brokers I hadn't worked with in over a decade, but whose numbers I still had. And he thanked me with the particular speed of someone eager to end a call before it asked anything more of him. I stood there afterward, with the receiver still warm in my hand, thinking less about freight brokers than about the sentence he'd almost let out before catching it. Told what I need to know when I need to know it. That wasn't the complaint of a man who felt trusted. That was the complaint of a man kept at the edge of something on purpose, close enough to be useful, far enough to be blamed for nothing if it went wrong, and spent the rest of the conversation trying to walk it back before I could ask a second question. I didn't sleep well that night. I told myself it was the 5-day waiting period, the strangeness of a legal process now grinding forward on a schedule I couldn't speed up, no matter how much I wanted to. But that wasn't the whole of it either. Some part of me already knew what the next morning held before I let myself think the words directly. I woke before the alarm, made coffee I didn't finish, and drove to the shop while the light was still gray over the orchard rows, along the river road, the same drive I'd made thousands of mornings before this one, though none of them had felt quite like this. I unlocked the front door, walked straight past the register without turning on the front lights, and stood in the back room, where the morning sun was just beginning to reach the east-facing window above the display case. Daylight the way I'd promised myself. A clear head the way I'd promised myself that too, though, standing there with my hand resting on the case's brass latch, I couldn't honestly say I had either one that morning. I opened the case and began the count from the top shelf down the way I always do, checking each piece methodically against the inventory ledger I'd carried in from the truck. Top shelf correct. Second shelf correct. I reached the third shelf and started counting the pocket watches, slower than I needed to, the way you slow down on purpose, right before you already know the answer your own hands are about to give you. 3 watches were missing from the third shelf. Not just any 3. The Rourke pocket watches the pair his great-great-grandfather had made in Triberg before the family crossed the Atlantic. The same pair I'd left Porter a voicemail about 3 weeks earlier, asking if he wanted them for himself. And beside them, the space where a 4th piece should have sat. A Swiss chronograph, a collector from Bend had consigned to me 18 months ago for eventual sale, worth more on its own than the other 2 combined. He'd never called me back about the Rourke watches. I'd told myself he was busy. I understood now that he hadn't needed to call back because by the time I left that message, the decision had likely already been made without me. I checked the ledger twice the way I check everything twice, and both times it told me the same thing. No loan out recorded. No consignment release signed. No sale entered anywhere in the system. As far as any paper in this shop could tell you, those 4 pieces should still have been sitting exactly where my hand now rested on empty velvet. I called Gideon before I'd finished closing the case. I need you to trace something for me as quickly as you're able. Watch sales, auction listings, dealer consignments, anything with the name Hartsfeld attached, going back 6 months. Specifically pocket watches. 2 identical pieces, hand-engraved, and a Swiss chronograph steel case, roughly 1952. "Give me 20 minutes or so," Gideon said. And he hung up before I could tell him why. I stood at the counter with the client's wristwatch still in my hand. A routine cleaning job, nothing urgent. The kind of small, unremarkable work that had filled most of my mornings for 40 years. And I don't remember deciding to set it down. I remember hearing the crystal crack against the counter's edge before I understood my own fingers had let go. I picked up the pieces. The case wasn't damaged, only the crystal. A $2 part I could replace before the customer ever noticed anything wrong. I stood there, holding the broken glass in my palm anyway, longer than the repair required, because it was the first thing in 8 days I hadn't been able to hold on to steadily. And some part of me needed to sit with that fact before I swept it into the bin and pretended it hadn't happened. Gideon called back in 17 minutes faster than he'd promised. Found the chronograph first. Sold through a specialty auction house out of Seattle 3 months ago. Consignment agreement signed electronically. Seller of record, Porter Hartsfeld. And the pocket watches. Different route. Private sale, this one, a collector's forum, the kind of place people go when they don't want an auction house taking a cut and asking questions about provenance. Listings still up, actually. Archived even after the sale closed. Photos, description, everything. Sold 6 weeks ago for $11,200 combined. Same seller account registered under Porter's email. $11,200. Plus whatever the chronograph brought. Chronograph went for $34,000 at auction minus the house's commission. Call it $30,000 net. $41,000 total across the two sales in the last 3 months. I did the arithmetic without wanting to. The way you can't stop yourself from finishing a calculation once it's started. $41,000 from the display case, $29,400 from Corinne's emergency account. $70,400 moved out from under me in the space of a few months. And not $1 of it spoken about at a single family dinner, not one word of it in a single phone call, while I sat across an empty chair every morning, thinking my son and I were simply drifting the way grief sometimes lets people drift quietly, without malice. Gideon, is there any record of what the money was used for? That part I can't get from a consignment file. But I did a basic search on the cider house while I had you on hold, public filings, nothing invasive. There's a UCC lien filed against Hartsfeld Cider House equipment 8 months ago. Small business loan called due for renegotiation this past summer. The renegotiated payment schedule starts exactly 2 weeks after the chronograph auction closed. I said nothing for a long moment. Gideon let the silence sit, which I appreciated more than he probably knew. He didn't come to me, I finally said. He had a business in trouble. His mother's watches were sitting behind glass 20 minutes from his house, and instead of walking in and telling me the truth, he found a way to take what he needed without ever having to ask for it. I can't speak to why, Gideon said. I can only tell you what the paper trail says. But for what it's worth, Ezekiel, the 2 withdrawals from the emergency account, the falsified guardianship filing, and now this, those aren't 3 separate bad decisions made independently of each other. That's a pattern. Someone was systematically converting everything with your name on it into cash on a timeline well before that text message about the trip ever reached your phone. I thought about the voicemail I'd left him about the Rourke watches. My own voice on his phone, asking if he wanted them, generously, freely, the way a father offers something he's proud to hand down. He'd let that message sit unanswered, while the watches themselves were already gone, already listed on a stranger's forum, already turned into a number on a loan renegotiation schedule. He hadn't needed my permission. He hadn't needed my blessing. He'd simply needed me not to notice. Until it no longer mattered, and for 6 weeks that plan had worked exactly as he'd hoped it would. I looked down at the broken crystal still sitting in my palm, and past it through the shop window, at the display case in the back room, where 3 generations of work had sat behind a lock nobody had thought to change. Send me everything you have in writing, I said, today. And Gideon, thank you. I know this isn't the kind of call anyone enjoys making to a client. It's not, he agreed, but you needed to hear it from someone who could prove it, not just suspect it. There's a difference, and I think you already know which one you were operating on, until about 20 minutes ago. I swept the broken glass into the bin, set the client's watch aside for a proper repair later, and walked to the back room to lock the display case, though there was nothing left inside it worth stealing that hadn't already been taken. I stood there a moment, with my hand on the empty shelf where the Rourke watches used to sit, and I thought about my father and the one mistake I'd made under his eye all those years ago, and how differently he had chosen to answer it than I now found myself wanting to answer this. I locked the shop's front door and didn't reopen it that day. I swept the workbench, though nothing on it needed sweeping. I refilled the ultrasonic cleaner's basin and emptied it again without running a single piece through it. The clock with no hands still hung on the wall behind the bench, waiting for Alden Rourke, who would never come. Outside, a truck downshifted on the river road, the sound rising and falling away. A bell on a bicycle somewhere down the block twice, then gone. The afternoon light moved an inch across the floor, and then another inch, and I stood in the middle of it doing nothing at all, which is not a thing do. At some point, I noticed the shop clock read 4:15 later than I'd realized, the light already beginning its slow autumn slide toward evening. I called Vince. "I know what happened to the watches," I said. "Gideon has the paper trail. Porter sold them. 2 consignments over 3 months to cover a loan renegotiation at the cider house." Vince was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing with that?" I dropped a customer's watch on the counter and cracked the crystal. That's the closest I've come to reacting since this started. And I'd rather talk about what happens next than what that means. Understood. What do you want to do? I want to know exactly what he can still reach. The shop, the trust, anything with my name attached that he has access to, key or otherwise, so I can close every one of those doors before he thinks to use another. That's the right question, Vince said. Come in tomorrow morning. Bring the trust documents, the shop's deed, anything showing who's listed where. I'll have Gideon there too. Between the 3 of us, we'll map every point of access you have and decide which ones need to close first. Tomorrow morning, I agreed. First thing, Ezekiel. One more thing, and I want you to actually hear it, not just let it pass. What Porter did selling those watches instead of asking you for help, that's not a reflection of anything you did wrong as a father. People in financial trouble make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. That doesn't excuse it. But you don't need to carry the question of whether you failed him into this meeting tomorrow. You didn't. I didn't answer that directly. What should I expect tomorrow? Walk me through it so I'm not surprised by anything. We'll start with the trust. I want to see exactly how it's structured, whether the shop and the building are held individually or jointly, whether Porter has any signing authority anywhere in the documents, even authority that was only ever meant to be used in an emergency, like power of attorney provisions that trigger under incapacity. Given what's already been filed against you, I want every one of those provisions identified and, where possible, revoked or restructured before anyone can point to them again. And the account Corinne set up. That one's more complicated because it's genuinely joint, not just emergency authorized. You have every legal right to move funds out of it unilaterally. You're a named holder, same as him. But I want to talk through the implications before you do anything, because how we frame that move matters if this ever becomes part of a larger dispute. I'm not interested in framing anything, Vince. I'm interested in making sure nothing else disappears while I'm still deciding how I feel about what already has. That's exactly why we're meeting at 9 instead of next week, he said. I'm not telling you to wait. I'm telling you to walk in tomorrow with a plan instead of just an inventory of what's already gone. There's a difference, and you're better at building the first one than most people I represent. I thanked him, told him I'd see him at 9, and hung up. I drove home slower than usual past the orchard rows, going gold at the edges the way they do this time of year. And I thought about Corinne's rule again. Watch it like a mainspring under tension. It looks like nothing's happening right up until it lets go all at once. I had watched. I had simply been watching the wrong account this entire time while the real damage moved quietly through a different part of the mechanism altogether. At the house, I sat at the kitchen table with the trust documents. Vince would need sorting them by date, the way I sort everything. And I found, near the bottom of the folder, the original deed transferring the shop from my father to me. 41 years old now, his signature still steady on the line above mine. He'd handed me that building without conditions, without a lock changed, without ever once asking what I'd do with it. I hadn't extended Porter the same trust in years. Not since he'd chosen the cider apprenticeship over the bench, and some old, unexamined part of me had resented that choice. Quietly, the whole time. The way you resent a door someone else chose to walk through instead of the one you built for them. I had never said that resentment aloud. Not once, not to Corinne, not to Porter, not even fully to myself. Until this exact moment, at this exact table. I had simply let it sit under the surface of every polite conversation we'd had for 11 years, the way a hairline crack sits under a watch face, invisible unless you know precisely where to look. And utterly determinative of whether the piece survives its next hard knock. None of that explained what he'd done. It didn't excuse it the way Vince had said. But sitting there, with my father's signature under the desk lamp, I let myself consider, for the first time since the text message 8 days ago, That I might not be the only one in this family who'd learned to handle disappointment by going quiet instead of speaking it aloud, and that the silence I was so good at keeping might have taught my son more than I'd ever meant to teach him. I thought too about the key Porter still carried, the one from when he was 19, and about how a man doesn't take 4 decades of a family's work off a shelf unless some part of him has already decided the shelf and the man who built it no longer fully belong to him either. I put the folder together for the morning, turned off the lamp, and sat a while longer in the dark kitchen before I finally went to bed. Corinne's chair across from me, the way it always is. And for the first time in 8 days, I didn't say her name out loud to the empty room. I simply let the quiet be quiet and went upstairs. The stairs creaking in the same 3 places they'd creaked for 40 years. A sound I no longer noticed except on nights like this one, when everything else had gone silent first. Vince's conference table was covered by 9 o'clock trust documents, the shop's deed, a county parcel map. Gideon had printed and marked up with yellow highlighter before I'd even arrived. "Start with the good news," Vince said. "The shop itself is clean. Sole ownership, no joint holders, no power of attorney provisions that trigger under incapacity. Porter has never had legal access to that building beyond the physical key you gave him as a teenager. We can void that access today with a simple letter and a locksmith." "Do it," I said. "Today, please." "Already scheduled. Locksmith's coming at 11. Vince slid the parcel map toward me. "The more interesting question is this." I looked at the map. My shop sat on Lot 14, a modest 1/4 acre along the main commercial strip. But the yellow highlighting extended well beyond it, across 3 additional parcels running down toward the river, land I'd bought outright in 1991, when a lumber company liquidated its old mill site, and nobody in town wanted riverfront property that smelled like creosote and looked like nothing. "That's mine too," I said. "Bought it for storage mostly, and because Corinne liked the idea of a garden down by the water someday. Weeds mostly, and the old mill foundation nobody's ever cleared. 11 acres of weeds and an old foundation sitting on some of the last undeveloped river frontage in town," Gideon said. "You'd be surprised how many people here know exactly what that's worth, even if you've never thought about it that way." He turned his laptop toward me. A county planning department filing dated 7 months ago. Pre-application inquiry for a mixed-use riverfront development. Applicant Callaway Ridge Partners, LLC. "That's Wyatt's company," I said. "Wyatt Callaway, registered agent," Gideon confirmed. The inquiry describes a boutique hotel and event space, 40 rooms requiring assembly of at least 8 contiguous acres along this stretch of river frontage to meet the county's density requirements. There are only 2 landowners in that stretch who haven't already sold to developers in the last decade. One is a conservation easement that can't be touched. The other is you. I sat back in my chair. Vince and Gideon let me sit within a moment. "I want to understand the scale of this," I said. "What's a project like that actually worth if he pulls it off?" "Conservatively 12 to 15 million in project value once it's built and operating," Gideon said. "Wyatt's company doesn't need to own the land forever to profit from this. He just needs to control it long enough to secure entitlements and either build it himself with investors or flip the assembled parcel to a hospitality group who will. And none of that works without my acres." "None of it works without your acres," Vince confirmed. "You're not incidental to this plan, Ezekiel. You're the obstacle the plan was built around removing." 7 months ago, I said slowly. Before any of this, before the withdrawals, before the medical filing, before any of it. 7 months ago is also roughly when property records show Wyatt's company made 2 informal approaches to you directly. "Did you know about those?" Gideon asked. "I got a letter last spring. Somebody interested in the river lots. I threw it away. I get those letters every couple of years, always from somebody who's never once bothered to drive out and look at what they're actually asking to buy. This one didn't stop at a letter," Vince said. "Once the direct approach failed, the pre-application shows a fallback assembly plan, a note from Wyatt's land planner indicating the applicant would explore alternative acquisition pathways if the current owner proved uncooperative or if ownership circumstances changed." The phrase sat in the room a moment before I understood its full shape. Ownership circumstances changed, I repeated. Meaning, if I were declared incompetent and my son became my guardian. Meaning exactly that, Gideon said. Porter as guardian would have financial authority over your assets, including authority to sell real property with a court's routine approval, which guardianship courts grant far more easily than people assume. Wyatt gets his 8 acres. Porter presumably gets a payment for making it happen, quietly structured however they wanted it structured. And you get moved into a facility in West Palm Beach or wherever they decided, with no legal standing left to object to any of it. I thought about the withdrawals structured to avoid detection. I thought about the falsified medical file timed with surgical precision. I thought about a text message that had arrived 4 words long, exactly 8 days before a filing deadline. None of it had ever really been about a cruise, or about Petra wanting privacy with her family, or even. I understood now primarily about the shop or the watches in the display case. Those had been convenient, opportunistic theft along the way. The real prize had been sitting quietly under my feet the entire time. 11 acres of river frontage that had never once occurred to me to think of as anything other than the place Corinne and I meant to build a garden someday. What do I do with 11 acres of land 3 people apparently wanted me declared insane to get their hands on? I asked. Vince and Gideon exchanged a look I recognized from 30 years of watching professionals decide silently who should be the one to answer. You make absolutely certain, Vince said, that no court order, no guardianship, no future filing of any kind could ever put that land within reach of anyone but you. Today, before Porter's ship even leaves the dock in Frankfurt. What does that actually involve? A few options. We could place the land in an irrevocable trust with a conservation-minded beneficiary, something that removes it from any future guardianship proceeding entirely, permanently, in a way nobody could ever unwind. That's the most extreme option and the most final. What's the alternative? A revocable trust with ironclad successor trustee provisions, naming someone other than Porter, combined with an immediate deed transfer out of your individual name. Less permanent, still fully within your control while you're alive and well, but structured so no guardianship petition could ever touch it. You keep the option to change your mind later. You just closed the door Wyatt and Petra were counting on walking through. I thought about Corinne, and the garden she'd wanted, and the 11 years since her death I'd let that land sit exactly as the lumber company left it. Meaning to get to it someday. The second option, I said. I'm not ready to give it away permanently. I am ready to make sure nobody takes it from me while I decide what it's actually for. Naomi Ferreira's office at the Hood River News occupied one corner of a converted feed store. The kind of newsroom that had shrunk to 4 desks and a part-time photographer over the last 15 years, but still ran the only paper anyone in the valley actually trusted. I'd known her since she covered the county fair ribbon results as a stringer 20 years ago. She'd covered my valuation testimony on the Kessling estate case more recently and written it up fairly, which is rarer than people think. You said this was urgent, she said, closing her office door. It is. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I'm not bringing you a tip. I'm bringing you a story that's already built with documentation, and I need to know if you can hold it until the right moment to publish. Show me what you have. I laid it out in order the way Vince had taught me to lay out anything for a professional who needed to move fast once they understood the shape of it. The structured withdrawals, the falsified medical evaluation, and Bramwell's cooperation, the forensic trail Gideon had built, connecting Petra's old login credentials to the exported file, the sale of the watches, the county planning filing tying Wyatt's development company to my river acreage, timed to a guardianship petition that would have made me legally unable to refuse a sale. Naomi didn't say anything until I'd finished. Then she pulled a legal pad toward her and started writing fast in a shorthand I couldn't read upside down. Walk me through the land piece again, she said, not looking up. Slowly. That's the part most readers won't expect, and it's the part that turns this from a sad family story into something people in this county actually need to know about their own local government. I walked her through it a second time, more slowly, and she stopped me twice to ask which county department had received the pre-application and whether Wyatt's firm had any other pending filings elsewhere in the valley that might suggest a pattern rather than a single opportunistic attempt. "I'll pull the county records myself before I run anything," she said. "I don't take a source's word for a filing I can verify independently in an afternoon. Even a source I trust as much as I trust you." "That's exactly how it should work," I said. "This isn't a family dispute story," she said, setting the pen down. "This is elder financial fraud, forged medical records, and a coordinated land grab all in one filing. I could run this by itself, but if you want it to land the way I think you want it to land, timing matters more than speed. They fly to Frankfurt Tuesday, connecting to Treberg the same day. Then we wait until they're airborne, or better, until they've landed somewhere without easy internet access. And we publish while they have no way to respond quickly or coordinate a story of their own. I can have this ready to go within 4 days. I'll need everything in writing from your attorney and your forensic accountant. Properly sourced. Nothing I can't stand behind if anyone pushes back. You'll have it by tomorrow." She looked up from the legal pad. "Ezekiel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer, because once this runs, there's no taking it back. Are you doing this because it's true, or because you're angry?" "Both," I said. "But it only goes to print because it's true. I've spent 40 years in a business where I could ruin a customer's trust in me with one dishonest sentence. I'm not about to build my son's downfall on anything less solid than what I'd stake my own name on." "That's the answer I needed to hear," she said, and went back to writing. I left her office a little past noon and found a message waiting from Gideon when I checked my phone in the truck. Not urgent sounding, but flagged for me to call when I had a few minutes. Which, with Gideon, usually meant he'd found something worth explaining in person rather than by text. He picked up on the first ring. "I went back through the emergency account structuring for a full accounting the way Vince asked," he said. "Found something adjacent to it I think you should know before Tuesday." "Go ahead." 3 weeks before the first $9,800 withdrawal, there's a draft document in Petra's old clinic email account. The one still linked to that stale login, addressed to Roy Calloway. A financial affidavit prepared for his signature attesting that he'd witnessed several conversations in which you expressed a desire to transfer control of your estate to Porter voluntarily. Dated, notarized blank, ready for him to sign. Did he sign it? No. There's a reply in the thread short from Roy's personal account, not the family group chain. He tells her he's not comfortable putting his name on something describing conversations he never actually witnessed. She responds, calling it a formality, tells him it protects the family, tells him Porter's counting on him. He never answers that message at all. The thread just ends. I thought about the phone call 2 days earlier, Roy's voice catching on the sentence he hadn't let himself finish. "I just get told what I need to know when I need to know it." He knew, I said. Not everything. But he knew enough to refuse and enough to be afraid of what refusing might cost him inside that family. "That's my read too," Gideon said. "For what it's worth, Ezekiel, not everyone standing near a fire lit it themselves. Some of them are just standing close enough to get burned along with everyone else when it finally catches. Should I tell Vince about this before the story runs, or does it change anything about the strategy?" "I'd tell him regardless. It doesn't change the core case against Petra or the land angle against Wyatt. But it might matter for how you and Naomi handle Roy specifically once this becomes public. He's not blameless. He was asked, and he said no, which means he understood enough to know what he was refusing. But there's a real difference between the person who drafted that affidavit and the person who read it and wouldn't put his name on it. If this story treats them identically, it might cost you credibility with anyone reading closely enough to notice the distinction. I'll pass it along today. One more thing. The reply from Roy's personal account, it came from an email address with a Bend, Oregon area code in the recovery phone number, not Hood River. I checked out of curiosity. Public records show a rental agreement under his name in Bend signed 4 months ago, separate from the family. He may have already been trying to put some distance between himself and whatever he suspected was coming. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the truck a while longer. In the newspaper's gravel lot, watching a hawk circle low over the orchard rows across the road. 4 days until Naomi's story went live. 2 days until a flight left Portland for Frankfurt carrying 5 members of a family who believed they had already won. Boarding a plane none of them yet understood was the last quiet moment they would have before everything they'd built on my back came apart, in the open, in daylight, in front of everyone who'd ever trusted a single word out of any of their mouths. Naomi's story went live at 6 o'clock Thursday morning, Pacific Time, 3 in the afternoon in the Black Forest, where I imagined, though I couldn't have known it yet, that the family was probably finishing lunch somewhere, with a view of the valley. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee I actually drank for once and refreshed the Hood River News website until the headline finally loaded. Elder fraud, forged medical records, and a land deal. How one family tried to take a clockmaker's life's work. Naomi had used my full name in the second paragraph, exactly as we'd agreed, and Wyatt's company name in the fourth. She'd been careful, with Roy a single sentence noting he'd declined to participate in the scheme when approached by source to a document, not a quote, exactly as Gideon had suggested handling it. By 6:40, the story had 11 shares. By 7:40, I watched the number the way I used to watch a movement's amplitude settle after a fresh cleaning. Small increments that told you everything about whether the whole thing was going to run true. Vince called at 7:15. It's moving faster than I expected. The Oregonian picked it up for a regional roundup already. Somebody's posted the county planning filing directly to a local subreddit with about 4,000 members, mostly people from the valley who know exactly which stretch of river Wyatt's talking about. Any word from Porter? Nothing yet. If they're doing what Naomi thinks they're doing, no cell service sightseeing all day, planning to check messages at the hotel tonight, you've probably got another 6 or 8 hours before any of this reaches them directly. And Bramwell, any fallout for him yet? The medical board complaint he filed himself is already referenced in the story, which I think actually helps him more than hurts him. Naomi wrote it exactly the way we discussed a doctor who discovered a serious lapse in his own system's security and self-reported before anyone forced him to. That's a very different story than a doctor who got caught. Readers can tell the difference, and apparently so can the 2 other local outlets that picked this up by mid-morning. 6 or 8 hours. I sat with that number for a while after Vince and I hung up, turning it over the way I'd turn over a fresh estimate before quoting a customer. And I understood, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that I had absolutely no control over what happened in those hours, and that not having control over it didn't feel the way I'd expected it to feel. I'd expected satisfaction. What I actually felt was closer to waiting for weather to arrive somewhere you can't see it forming. By 9 that morning, the share count had climbed past 600. By 11 past 2,000, with comments accumulating faster than I could bring myself to read them. Neighbors I recognized by name, customers I'd served for decades, people from 3 counties over, who'd apparently followed the cider house's social media and now had opinions about all of it. I closed the laptop around noon. Not because I'd stopped caring what people thought, but because I'd started to feel watching strangers debate my own family's collapse in real time, like a man reading his own obituary before he'd actually finished dying. 1,400 miles and 9 time zones away, in a town I had never visited and had only ever seen in photographs Corinne kept in a shoebox from her grandfather's old letters. The family was, in fact, finishing lunch. I learned the details only later, secondhand. The way you learn most things about people who've spent months keeping you carefully in the dark. They'd taken the funicular up to the Overlook that morning. Walked the Cuckoo Clock district in the early afternoon, Petra filming herself in front of half a dozen shop fronts for a sponsored post she'd queue up for later, once she had signal again. Wyatt had ordered a second round of the local beer at an outdoor cafe near the church, loud enough that the waitress asked him twice to lower his voice. Vernon and Lorraine Petra's parents, who'd flown separately and met the group in Frankfurt, sat at the far end of the table, comparing photos on their phones. Oblivious to everything except the beauty of a town neither of them had ever previously thought to visit. Porter sat slightly apart from the rest of them, according to what I pieced together afterward. Quieter than usual, checking his phone every few minutes, out of habit, even though the hotel's front desk had confirmed there was no reliable signal until they returned to the valley floor that evening. It was Vernon, of all of them, who noticed the man at the next table. An older gentleman American by his accent, traveling with what looked like a small tour group, scrolling something on his phone, with an expression somewhere between fascinated and appalled. I only learned the details of that afternoon much later, pieced together from Naomi's own follow-up reporting and from things Porter eventually told me himself, in a very different conversation, on a very different phone call. But I've turned the scene over enough times since then that I can see it clearly, the way I can look at a movement I've never actually held and still know exactly how its wheels must have engaged. "You're not going to believe this," the stranger said to his companion, loudly enough to carry across 2 tables in a courtyard built for quiet lunches. "There's a whole family from Oregon in this article. Some kind of scam against the old man's own son." Vernon, who prided himself on never missing anything anyone said within earshot, turned his head. "Oregon," he repeated, half to himself, and reached for his own phone before he'd fully decided to. He didn't have signal. Nobody at the table did. But the stranger's tour group had paid for a temporary satellite hotspot for the week, sitting openly on their table, between the breadbasket and a half-finished plate of spätzle. And Vernon, never a man who understood the concept of a boundary. He hadn't personally erected, simply reached over and asked with the particular confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted from strangers, whether he might borrow it for just a moment. The stranger, not yet understanding what he was about to hand over, said, "Of course." He read the headline once, silently. Then he read it again aloud, his voice rising with each word until half the courtyard turned to look, and the last quiet afternoon any of them would have for a long time came apart right there over spätzle and a stranger's borrowed hotspot, 9 time zones from the kitchen table where all of it had started, 8 days before their flight ever left the ground. The courtyard went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet right before it gets loud again. Everyone recalibrating for half a second before deciding how to react. Wyatt was the first to move. He crossed to Vernon's table in 4 strides, snatched the phone from his hand without asking, and read the article himself, his lips moving slightly the way they did when he was concentrating on something that mattered to him and nothing else in the world. "Callaway Ridge Partners," he said out loud, reading his own company's name back to himself like it belonged to a stranger. "They've got the pre-application, the land planner's memo. Ezekiel. They've got everything." "Ezekiel," Petra repeated, and I'm told her voice had already begun to shake by then, though nobody at that table would confirm it to Naomi later, on the record. "This isn't..." He doesn't understand the context. "None of this is what it looks like. It says you accessed a former employer's record system 4 months after you left," Wyatt said, still reading, his voice climbing. "It says there's a document trail connecting a forged medical evaluation directly to your login." "Petra, is that true?" "Dad, I can explain the timeline if you'll just let me..." "Explain it to me right now, then. Because from where I'm standing, my company's entire riverfront project just got named in a fraud investigation involving my own daughter, and I have exactly 1 hour before every investor I've ever worked with in this state sees the same article I'm holding." It's not what it sounds like when a reporter writes it that way. Ezekiel provoked this. He's been unstable since his wife passed. Everyone in this family has said so for years, you included, Dad. I was trying to protect what we built. I was trying to protect Porter's future. Petra. Wyatt's voice dropped, which somehow made it worse than the shouting had been. I have sat across a negotiating table from men far more dangerous than a 70-year-old clockmaker in Hood River, Oregon. I know exactly what protecting a family's future actually looks like. And it does not look like a forged medical evaluation and a login you weren't authorized to use. Don't you dare stand here and tell me this was about Porter. Dolores hadn't said a word since Vernon first read the headline aloud. She sat very still, her hands flat on the table on either side of an untouched glass of the local beer, staring at a point somewhere past her daughter's shoulder. "Mom," Petra said. "Say something." "What would you like me to say?" Dolores's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than Wyatt's, but somehow carried further. "That I'm proud of you. That I don't understand how a $47,000 wardrobe and a $2 million home came from sponsorship deals and a husband's cider business alone, and I simply chose not to ask. I chose not to ask Petra, That was my mistake. I won't be making it again." She stood, smoothed her dress with both hands, and walked toward the courtyard's stone archway without looking back, leaving her half-finished lunch and her husband still gripping a stranger's phone. Wyatt set the phone down on the table, not gently. "I need to call my attorney. Today. Before this gets worse than it already is." He looked at Petra for a long moment, the way a man looks at an investment he's already decided to write off. "You should have come to me before any of this. I could have found you money legitimately. I could have structured something clean. Instead, you handed me a fraud case with my own company's name in the 4th paragraph." He followed Dolores out without waiting for a response. Roy hadn't spoken at all. He sat with his hands folded on the table, and when Petra finally turned to him, the last person left who might say something in her defense, he only shook his head slowly. "I told you I wasn't signing that affidavit," he said. "I told you I wouldn't be part of it. You did this anyway without me, and now you're going to ask me to stand here and defend it in front of everyone." "I'm not asking you to defend anything, Roy. I'm asking you not to walk away from your own sister. I already found an apartment in Bend 4 months ago," he said, standing. "I haven't told anyone yet because I didn't want to make it into a whole thing before I was ready. I'm ready now." He looked at her a moment longer, something that might have been sadness passing briefly across his face before it hardened back into resolve. "I hope it was worth it, Petra. I really do. I don't think it was." He left the way his parents had, through the stone archway, and didn't look back either, though he did pause just past the threshold, long enough that I've always wondered whenever Porter tells this part of the story, whether some smaller and better version of Roy had almost turned around. That left Porter. He hadn't said a single word through any of it. Not when Wyatt read his company's name aloud, not when Dolores delivered her quiet verdict, not when Roy stood and walked away. He sat across from his wife at a table littered with abandoned plates and one still glowing phone screen. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Porter." Petra's voice had changed again, softer now, reaching for the one person left at the table. "Say something. Please. You're the only one who hasn't already decided what I am." I don't know exactly what he said to her in that courtyard because that part of the story never made it into Naomi's article, and Porter has never told me the words directly, only that there were words and that they weren't many. What I do know is what happened 40 minutes later when he walked alone back to the hotel room, while Petra remained at a cafe table surrounded by strangers who'd stopped pretending not to listen to and sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in a country he'd never wanted to visit under circumstances he'd helped engineer himself, and picked up his phone to check out of pure habit whether he finally had enough signal to make a call. He had 1 bar. Just enough. He told me later he sat there for almost 20 minutes before he actually dialed, turning the phone over in his hands the way I turn over a movement I'm not yet sure how to fix, trying to find the one entry point that wouldn't make everything worse the moment he touched it. He thought he said about calling Vince first, or Naomi, someone whose job it was to soften bad news before it reached the person it was actually meant for. He decided against it. Whatever came next, he told himself, it needed to come from him directly, in his own voice. However badly that voice was shaking by the time he finally found the courage to use it. Vince called at 4 the next afternoon, and I knew from the first word that it was over before he'd told me anything at all. "Petition dismissed," he said. Judge Okonkwo Reyes ruled from Chambers didn't even need to schedule a hearing. Cited Bramwell's sworn statement, Gideon's forensic report, and, I'll admit I enjoyed this part more than I probably should have, a formal letter from the county confirming you remain an active examiner on their own competency roster. Her written order specifically notes the irony of the petition without using the word irony. Lawyers aren't allowed to have fun in print. So she found other ways. And the rest of it referred to the district attorney's office as a possible structuring and elder fraud case separate from the family court matter entirely. That part moves on its own timeline now, out of my hands and into people whose job is exactly this. Naomi's story already did most of the public groundwork. This will likely move faster than these things usually do. Thank you, Vince. For all of it. You did most of it yourself, he said. I just kept it inside the lines. Get some rest tonight, Ezekiel. You've earned an evening where nothing else happens. Nothing else happened for exactly 2 hours and 11 minutes. The shop phone rang at 6:31. I saw the country code before I saw the name, and my hand was steadier than I expected it to be when I picked it up. Dad. Porter's voice, small and strange across all that distance, static thin behind it, like the call itself was fighting to survive the ocean between us. Dad, thank God. I've been trying to call for an hour. The signal here is— I know, I said. There's been a lot happening on this end, too. There's some kind of mistake with an account. The hotel's saying there's a hold, some kind of flag on the family card, and I don't understand— Porter, if you could just call the bank, explain there's been some kind of error. Porter, do you want to try that sentence again? This time tell me the truth. Silence. 10 seconds of it, maybe 15. Long enough that I could hear faintly a door somewhere on his end, a voice that might have been Petra's cut off. I stood in the shop with the phone against my ear, the workbench behind me. The clock with no hands still hanging on the wall where it had hung for 4 years, and I found myself thinking, unbidden, about the exact tone my own father had used. The one time I'd stood in this same room, waiting to be told what I already knew he thought of me. He hadn't shouted. He had simply gone quiet and stayed quiet for the better part of a season. And I had spent that season learning that silence could be its own kind of sentence, one with no fixed release date. I didn't want to hand my son that same sentence without at least first hearing what he had to say. Whatever came next, I owed him that much even now. Dad, His voice cracked in the middle of the word, and when he spoke again, it had dropped entirely out of the register he'd been using since I picked up. The careful, managed tone of a man rehearsing an excuse replaced by something rawer and much younger. I knew everything, Dad. Not from the very first day, but close enough to it. Close enough that pretending I didn't would just be one more lie on top of everything else. Since when? I asked. Not sharp. Just precise, the way I ask any customer to be precise about when a problem actually started. Since the withdrawals. The first one, even. Petra told me it was temporary, that we'd pay it back before you ever noticed that it was our money too in every way that mattered, because we'd inherit it eventually anyway. I believed her, or I let myself believe her, which I understand now isn't really the same thing at all. And the filing the medical evaluation. Not at first. I swear to you, Dad, not at first. I found out about that maybe 10 days before you did. I should have come to you the moment I knew. I kept telling myself there'd be a better time, a calmer conversation, some version of this where I could explain it so it didn't sound as bad as it actually was. There was never going to be a version like that. I understand that now. I think some part of me understood it even then. I didn't say anything. I had learned over 8 days exactly how much information silence could pull out of a person who was already standing at the edge of telling the truth. It wasn't because I stopped loving you, he said, and he was crying now. 34 years old, crying into a phone in a country neither of us had ever set foot in together. I was afraid Petra would leave if I didn't go along with it. Afraid of what I'd be without the business, without the inheritance, without any of it. Afraid of just being nobody. And somewhere in the middle of being that afraid, I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting my marriage and helping destroy my father. The watches, I said quietly. Tell me about the watches. Another silence, shorter this time, but heavier. The cider house was going under. The loan renegotiation was going to fail without a cash injection I didn't have. I told myself I was borrowing against my own inheritance early, that it would all even out eventually, that you'd probably even understand if I explained it right. I never explained it. I just took them. And I told myself that wasn't really stealing if they were going to be mine someday anyway. I sat down slowly at the counter, the phone still pressed to my ear, and looked at the register calendar, still showing October 14th, circled in red. A date that had already come and gone while I wasn't looking. A trip that had already stopped mattering days ago, without either of us noticing exactly when. Dad, please say something. I thought about a night in this same shop 40-some years ago, standing across a workbench from my own father, waiting for him to say something after a mistake of my own, a customer's balance wheel ruined by a hand still too young to trust with it, and how long the silence had gone on that night, and how it had never, not once, in the decades since, actually ended. I know, son, I said finally. I know everything. I didn't say anything else. I let the silence stretch out across 9 time zones and an ocean, and for a long moment neither one of us tried very hard to fill it. Both of us simply sitting with everything that had finally, after 8 days, been said aloud. Somewhere behind Porter, faintly, a window unit hummed. A door in the hallway outside his room opened and closed. Someone laughed briefly 2 rooms over in a language neither of us spoke. I sat at my own counter 4,000 miles away and listened to a foreign hotel breathe through the receiver, and neither of us said anything at all for the better part of a minute, the static filling the space where words should have been. Dad. His voice, when it finally came again, was smaller than before. What happens now? I don't know yet, I said, and it was the first entirely honest thing either of us had managed to say to the other in 8 long days. I'm not going to pretend I do, just to make this call easier for either one of us. Are you going to press charges against me? He asked, after a long silence. I mean against me specifically, not against Petra. I thought about that question longer than he probably wanted me to, though I don't think he expected a fast answer either. I don't know that yet, I said again. What I do know is that whatever happens with the district attorney's office is going to happen regardless of anything I decide personally. Vince tells me structuring and elder fraud cases move on their own timeline once they're referred. That part isn't really up to either of us anymore, and the rest of it between the two of us, you and me. That part is up to both of us. But not tonight, Porter. Tonight I need you to just let this sit the way I'm going to let it sit. And we'll talk properly when there isn't an ocean, and a collapsing hotel bill, and everyone else's disaster crowding into the conversation. There's a bill, he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in it. Some of the fear finally draining out and leaving only tiredness behind. The hotel here. Petra maxed out the emergency card covering things after her account's locked. Roy's gone. Her parents have already booked separate flights home, first available seats, didn't even ask if we needed help getting back. I don't know how we're getting home yet. That's not my problem to solve tonight, I said gently as I could manage. I'm sorry, I mean that, but it isn't. He didn't argue with me. I think some part of him had known before he even dialed that I wasn't going to be the one who fixed this particular problem. Not this time, maybe not ever again. In quite the automatic way I always had before. What about the shop? He asked after a silence. Might he want the key back? I still have the one from when I was 19. I should have given it back years ago, honestly. Once I stopped actually working there, and you knew I never would again. Vince already changed the locks, I said. This morning. I want you to understand that wasn't me trying to punish you specifically. It was me making sure nothing else disappeared while I still didn't know how far any of this went. That's fair, he said quietly. That's more than fair, actually, given everything. What about Petra? Where does that stand between the two of you? I don't know yet either, he admitted. I think I need to know what happens with the legal side before I can even start figuring out the rest of it. Right now, I mostly just feel like I don't recognize the last year of my own life. I love you, Dad. Whatever else is true, I need you to know that's still true. I know, I said. I love you too. That's never once been the question in any of this. We said goodbye the way two people say goodbye when neither one knows what the next conversation is going to sound like. Careful, a little formal, both of us aware that something had shifted permanently in the 8 days since a text message had arrived on a countertop at 5:52 in the morning. I set the phone down and sat alone in the shop for a long time after the call ended. The register light off the street outside, gone fully dark, and I found that I didn't especially want to go home to an empty kitchen just yet. So I stayed instead, doing nothing in particular, letting the quiet do whatever it needed to do to me before I was ready to face anyone, including myself. I thought about the phrase Porter had used. I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting my marriage and helping destroy my father. And I turned it over, the way I turn over any statement a customer makes about how a piece came to be broken, listening less for the facts, which I usually already know, than for the shape of the excuse itself, what it reveals about how the person understands their own hands. Porter's excuse hadn't tried to make what he'd done sound smaller than it was. That counted for something, I thought, though I wasn't yet ready to decide exactly how much. I called Vince once more before I finally locked up for the night, mostly so he'd have it on record, while it was still fresh in both our memories. He confessed, I said. Knew about the withdrawals almost from the start. Found out about the guardianship filing roughly 10 days before I did, and said nothing. Admitted to selling the watches himself to cover the cider house loan. Vince was quiet for a moment. That matters for how the DA's office might eventually look at his exposure separate from Petra's. Cooperation and voluntary disclosure tend to weigh in a person's favor, especially compared to someone who forged medical documents and structured cash withdrawals to avoid federal reporting. I'll make a note of the call date and time in case it's ever relevant. But Ezekiel, how are you doing with all of this personally? Not as a case, as a father. Ask me again in a few weeks, I said. I don't think I know the answer yet. That's an honest answer, Vince said. It's usually the only kind worth giving in my experience, especially this early on. Go home, Ezekiel. Eat something. This isn't a night to spend alone in an empty shop pretending you're only thinking about paperwork and legal exposure. I told him I would, though I stayed another 20 minutes after we hung up anyway. Sitting in the dark with my hands flat on the counter, listening to the particular silence of a building that has just finished holding more than it was built to hold in a single day. And finding, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, something that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief either, but sat closer to both of them than to anything else I had a ready name for. Some third thing without a word of its own that I suspected I'd be sitting with for a long while yet. 3 weeks passed. The way weeks pass after something enormous has already happened, and the world simply continues unbothered, expecting you to continue with it. Vince called on a Tuesday with the indictment news. Petra's been formally charged, structuring under federal law plus state charges for elder financial exploitation and falsifying medical records. The U.S. Attorney's Office is handling the federal piece jointly with the county DA on the state charges. Her attorney's already floating a plea discussion, which usually means they've looked at the evidence and don't like what they see. What's the exposure look like if it goes that direction? Realistically, given the amounts involved and the fact that this targeted an elderly relative specifically, we're probably looking at real prison time, not just probation and restitution. I won't pretend to know the exact number until a judge says it out loud, but it won't be nothing. Structuring a loan carries up to 5 years federally. Combine that with the state fraud charges and a judge who takes elder exploitation seriously, and you're looking at a sentence that will define the next several years of her life. And Porter? Has anyone from the DA's office reached out to him directly? Not formally, not yet. His voluntary disclosure to you, and through you to me, puts him in a different category than Petra. He wasn't the one who structured withdrawals or forged documents. Whether he faces any charges at all likely comes down to how prosecutors weigh knowledge versus active participation. I've told his own attorney informally that cooperation now will matter considerably later. What he does with that advice is between him and his own lawyer, not something I can control from where I sit. And Bramwell cleared, essentially. The medical board reviewed his self-report and issued a formal reprimand for inadequate access controls, nothing that touches his license. I think he'll keep practicing. I also think he'll never leave a record system unattended again for the rest of his career. And Wyatt? No criminal exposure that I'm aware of. Nothing suggests he knew about the guardianship scheme before Naomi's article, but his business is a different story. I heard from a colleague who works development law in the Valley that 3 of his investors pulled out within a week of publication. Callaway Ridge Partners dissolved the riverfront project entirely. He's apparently trying to salvage his firm's reputation on 2 smaller projects that don't involve anyone named Hartsfeld. I sat with that a moment, turning it over. I felt less satisfaction than I might have expected 3 weeks earlier, sitting in Vince's office, reading my own name under the word respondent. And the land trust? I asked. Did the transfer finalize? Recorded with the county 11 days ago. The parcels are fully protected now, irrevocable enough to survive any future guardianship attempt, revocable enough that you still control every decision about what actually happens on that land while you're alive to make them. Nobody touches it without your signature. Not Porter, not some future version of this family, not anyone. I thanked him and we talked briefly about scheduling, and after we hung up, I drove out to the river lots for the first time in longer than I could easily account for, past the shop. Past the old mill foundation, half swallowed by blackberry canes, down to the water's edge, where Corinne used to say she could already see the garden if she squinted hard enough and used enough imagination. I'd never squinted hard enough myself. I stood there that afternoon and tried for the first time in 11 years and found that I could almost see it too. Not the garden exactly, but the shape of what it might become on my own schedule. Built on ground nobody could ever again try to take from me by declaring me unfit to keep it. A bench near the water, a path wide enough for 2, or narrow enough that a man could walk it alone without feeling the empty space beside him quite so sharply. I didn't decide anything definite that afternoon. I only stood there long enough to let myself want something again, which felt, after 6 weeks of mostly wanting nothing at all, like its own small kind of progress. I heard over the following weeks, second-hand and in fragments, what became of the rest of them. Vernon and Lorraine returned to their gated community outside Bend, and according to a mutual acquaintance from the Fair Board, stopped attending the same church they'd belonged to for a decade, apparently unable to face the questions. Roy settled into his apartment, quietly took a job managing inventory for a sporting goods distributor, and sent Porter a single text message weeks later that read only, "I'm sorry, I couldn't do more than refuse. I hope you're all right." Petra's plea negotiations dragged into December. Dolores, I heard, visited her exactly once at the county facility during the period she was held, before Bale and Wyatt did not visit at all. Porter called every 10 days or so, always brief, always careful, neither of us quite sure yet what the calls were supposed to accomplish beyond simply keeping a thread of contact from going fully slack. He was living in a rented room above a friend's garage in town. The cider house sold to cover what remained of the debt the marriage to Petra. Technically still intact on paper, but, as far as I could tell from what little he said about it, existing now mostly in name. He'd started working part-time for a landscaping crew. Physical labor of a kind he hadn't done since he was a teenager, helping me open the shop on Saturday mornings. And something in the way he mentioned it, almost shyly, like he expected me to find it beneath him somehow, told me he was surprised to find he didn't mind the work at all. We talked about small things mostly. Weather, a minor repair on his rented room's water heater that he asked my advice about, the way he used to ask when he was younger and still believed I had an answer for everything mechanical in the world. Neither of us brought up the trip, or the watches, or the courtyard in Treberg, though I suspected both of us were carrying all of it into every careful, ordinary conversation, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, without mentioning its weight to anyone. On the first Thursday of December, 6 weeks after a text message had arrived on my counter at 5:52 in the morning, he called and asked for the first time since any of it began if he could come by the shop. Not to talk on the phone, in person. He said he had something he needed to say to me that he didn't think would survive being said through a screen or across an ocean or down a phone line. Something that needed a room and a workbench and both of us standing in it at the same time. I told him Thursday afternoon would be fine. I spent most of Thursday morning deciding what I wasn't going to say. I have never been a man of many words. Not with customers, not with Corinne, not even with myself most days. And I'd told myself for 6 weeks that when this conversation finally came, I would know exactly what to say. once I was standing in front of him. Thursday morning arrived, and I found that wasn't true at all. I tried out sentences in the empty shop before it opened, out loud to no one, the way I sometimes talk through a difficult repair before I actually pick up the tool, and every single one of them sounded wrong the moment it left my mouth. Either too soft, forgiving something I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive, or too hard, closing a door I wasn't entirely sure I wanted closed. Forever either. I thought about my father, the season of silence he'd handed me after the balance wheel, and how that silence had never actually ended, not really. Not even after he died. Because he'd never once come back to finish the sentence he'd started by going quiet. I had spent 40 years believing that was simply what a serious man did, with a serious disappointment. I was no longer entirely sure I believed that anymore, sitting in my own shop on a gray Thursday morning, waiting for my own son to walk through a door I had at least made sure still had a working lock. Around 10, I walked to the back room and opened a drawer I hadn't opened in longer than I could remember. The one where I keep pieces too far gone to repair, but too well made to throw away. I found what I was looking for near the bottom, a small mantel clock. Walnut case movement, intact, dial clean, but no hands at all. Removed decades ago by whoever owned it before it ended up in my father's inventory, and then mine for a repair that had apparently never been finished, and never would be. Now, the original owner long since impossible to trace. I set it on the workbench in the exact spot where I do all my final assembly work, and I looked at it for a long time. I have a rule I teach every apprentice who comes through this shop, the same rule my father taught me on this same bench. You always set the hands last. Not because it's mechanically necessary, the movement runs perfectly well without them ticking along in the dark of its own case, keeping time nobody can see. You set the hands last because it's the one step in the entire process with no room for correction afterward. Everything else you can adjust, disassemble, true up again if you get it wrong. The hands once mounted and calibrated either tell the truth or they don't. Set them 1 minute off even by accident, even with the best intentions in the world, and the clock will keep that lie faithfully, precisely, for as long as anyone lets it run. I had never once in 40 years of teaching that rule to nervous 15-year-olds, standing exactly where Porter used to stand, thought to apply it to anything other than clocks. It took a walnut case with no hands sitting on my own workbench on the worst morning of an already long 6 weeks, to make me understand that I'd been living by that same rule my entire life, without ever once naming it as a rule at all. I had set the hands on my relationship with Porter years ago, quietly, without ever telling him the moment he chose the cider apprenticeship over the bench. And I had let that setting run unquestioned and uncorrected for 11 years, telling myself it was simply the shape our relationship had settled into when, in fact, I had never once gone back to check whether it was still telling the truth. I thought about calling Vince just to have something ordinary to do with the remaining hour before Porter arrived and decided against it. Some conversations I was beginning to understand needed to happen without a lawyer's careful framing standing between the two people actually having them. I made coffee I didn't drink the same as I had most mornings since this began and sat at the bench turning the handless clock over in my palms, feeling the weight of a mechanism that had been keeping perfect, invisible, unverifiable time for who knew how many decades, patiently in the dark, waiting for someone to finally trust it enough to give it a face again. I heard his truck in the gravel lot a little before 2 earlier than we'd agreed, and I didn't go to the window to watch him park the way I might have once. I stayed at the bench, the handless clock in front of me, and waited for the bell over the door. It took him almost a full minute after the engine went quiet before he actually came inside. I could hear him out there, gravel shifting under his boots, not quite pacing, not quite standing still either. When the bell finally rang, he stepped in slowly, the way a man steps into a room he genuinely doesn't know whether he's still welcome in. He looked older than 6 weeks should reasonably account for. Thinner, too, the landscaping work visible in his forearms, in a way office work at the cider house never had been. His hands rougher, more like mine than I remembered them being. The last time I'd actually looked closely. Dad. Just that at first, nothing else.
Porter,
He stood just inside the door, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes moving once around the shop, the bench, the tools, the wall where the handless clock had hung untouched for 4 years before I'd taken it down that morning, before finally settling on me. "I thought about what to say for 6 weeks straight," he said. "I still don't think I have it right, even now standing here." "Neither did I, if that helps at all coming from someone who's had the same 6 weeks to work with." Something in his shoulders loosened slightly. Not relief exactly, but the smallest possible easing of a weight he'd clearly been carrying since he parked. He crossed the shop floor slowly, past the register, past the case that used to hold 3 generations of work and now held considerably less than it once had, and stopped on the other side of the workbench. Close enough now that I could see he hadn't slept much the night before either. I didn't say anything yet about the clock sitting between us. I let him look at it first the way I let any apprentice look at an unfinished piece before I tell them what it's for, giving him the chance to notice on his own exactly what was missing from its face and exactly what that missing thing might mean coming from a man who never did anything in this shop by accident. Porter looked down at the clock for a long moment before he said anything at all. "No hands," he said finally. "I don't think I've ever seen you leave a piece like this out on the bench before. You always keep the unfinished ones in the back." "I brought it out this morning. On purpose." He looked up at me then, something wary crossing his face. The particular wariness of a man who suspects he's about to be taught a lesson, and isn't yet sure whether he has the strength left to receive one. "Whose is it?" he asked. "I don't recognize the case." "Nobody's anymore. It came into the shop before your grandfather retired for a repair that never got finished properly. Whoever owned it either forgot about it or moved on with their life, and it just sat in that back drawer for longer than either of us has been alive, probably. I found it again this morning, looking for something else entirely. And you decided this was the morning to bring it out." "I decided this was the morning it might finally be useful for something." He pulled the stool out from under the far end of the bench, the one he used to sit on as a teenager while I worked, and lowered himself onto it. Slowly, like a man testing whether a chair still remembered him after all these years of staying away from it. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck idled somewhere down the block, then pulled away, and the ordinary sound of it felt strange against the weight of everything sitting on the bench between us. "Do you remember," I said, "why I always made you set the hands last? Every single piece, all those Saturdays? Not first, not in the middle, always last?" He thought about it. I watched him actually think about it the way he used to think about a difficult repair when he was 19 and still believed the bench might be his life's work, before he'd decided, or let himself be talked into deciding, that it wasn't. "I don't know," he said. "I always figured it was just how you'd learned it. Habit, maybe. Grandpa's rule. It's not habit." I picked up the clock, turned it once in my hands so the empty dial caught the afternoon light coming through the front window, and set it back down between us. Every other part of a repair you can go back and fix. Adjust the escapement, true up, the balance, replace a worn jewel. The movement forgives almost anything, as long as it's still running underneath. But the hands are different. Set them 1 minute off, just one, and the clock will keep that lie faithfully for the rest of its life. It won't know it's lying. It'll just keep telling the wrong time precisely confidently for as long as anyone lets it run, because nothing inside the mechanism itself knows any better. I pushed the clock an inch closer to him across the worn wood of the bench. "Family works the same way," I said. "One lie set early enough, quietly enough, and it just keeps running. Nobody inside it necessarily even means for it to happen. It just does, and it keeps doing it until somebody finally stops the whole thing and opens the case back up to see what's actually gone wrong inside." Porter didn't say anything. He looked at the clock for a long time, longer than he'd looked at anything since he'd walked through the door, and I watched his throat work once, twice, the way a man's throat works when he's decided not to trust his voice with whatever comes next. "I keep thinking about the withdrawals," he said finally, his voice low. "How easy the first one was. Petra explained it, and it made sense in the moment, and I let it make sense. And then the next one was even easier because the first one hadn't blown up yet. I understand now. That's exactly how it works. It's not one big decision, it's 100 small ones, each one a little easier than the last one, until you look up and you've built something you never would have agreed to if anyone had shown you the whole shape of it on day one. That's most of how people end up somewhere they never meant to go, I said. Very few men wake up and decide all at once to become someone they'd be ashamed of. It usually happens one small, defensible choice at a time. And by the time the shape of it is obvious, they've already told themselves the story often enough to half believe it. Is that what happened to you? He asked. With your own father? You've never really talked about him. Not like this. I hadn't expected the question, and I took a moment before I answered it. He set his hands early, too, I said. After I ruined that balance wheel, he never said another harsh word about it, not once in all the years after. He just quietly stopped trusting me with anything that mattered for the better part of 2 years. And by the time he started again, neither of us ever spoke about why or when it had actually changed back. I used to think that was restraint. I'm not sure anymore it wasn't just its own kind of cowardice dressed up as patience. I didn't tell him I forgave him. I didn't reach across the bench and pull him into the kind of embrace that would have made this feel to either of us like something already finished, already resolved safely behind us. I wasn't ready to make either of those gestures, and some part of me suspected he wasn't ready to receive them yet either. Not honestly, not in a way that would actually hold. I simply stood there on my side of the bench and let him stand on his, the handless clock between us, saying nothing else at all. The shop was quiet except for the other clocks, a dozen of them, mounted on the walls and standing in the corners. Each one keeping its own small, separate, faithful account of the same afternoon. Their seconds landing slightly out of step with one another, the way they always did. A soft, uneven ticking that filled the whole room without either of us needing to fill it with anything ourselves. Porter reached out finally and touched the edge of the empty dial with one finger carefully, the way you touch something you're not entirely sure you're allowed to. Neither of us said the word forgiveness. Neither of us needed to, not yet, not that particular afternoon. There was only the ticking, dozens of unsynchronized seconds, moving forward together anyway. Each one a small, ordinary proof that time even lied to even set wrong for a while. Keeps finding its way back toward true, slowly, imperfectly, one correction at a time. If somebody is willing to stay in the room long enough to make them. The shop closes at 6 most nights now, same as it always has, and most evenings the last thing I do before locking the door is walk past the display case and glance at the empty space where 3 pieces used to sit. I haven't filled it back in. I'm not sure yet if I will, or if some spaces are meant to stay open a while longer, holding the shape of what was taken so nobody forgets it was ever there at all. I used to believe a mistake once made could only be answered one way. Cut clean. No second setting. The door closed for good. I had lived by that belief so long I mistook it for wisdom instead of what it actually was. A wound from my own father, dressed up in the language of standards. What I understand now is quieter and less satisfying than the old certainty. Some lies can be corrected slowly, imperfectly, by 2 people willing to stay in the room together long after the easier thing would be to walk out of it. Not forgiven all at once. Reset one small honest minute at a time, the way you'd true up a movement nobody thought was worth saving. I think about Corinne on the walk home most evenings. The chair still across from mine. The garden we're finally, slowly, actually building down by the river. One Saturday at a time. Porter's hands in the dirt beside mine now more often than not. I don't know if she'd call what I did right. I know she'd call it honest, which she always said mattered more than being right ever did. I thank God most nights that she left me that card before she went. Words I might never have found the courage to write myself. And I thank him again quietly. Every time Porter's truck actually shows up in the gravel lot on a Saturday morning, instead of finding some reason not to come. I've prayed on all of it more nights than I've told anyone, asking less for forgiveness than for the patience to keep offering it in small enough doses that it might actually hold. God doesn't fix a broken clock by making the past unbroken. God just gives you enough mornings, one after another, to keep setting it true. And enough grace to notice when one of those mornings has quietly become a good one. If you were standing where I stood, watching your own child slide one small choice at a time towards something you never taught him to become, would you have shut the door or left it open a crack, not knowing yet whether anyone would ever walk back through it? I don't think there's a clean answer. I'd genuinely like to hear yours in the comments below. I read every one of them myself. And if this story found something in you worth sitting with a while longer, stay close. There are more of these mornings still to tell.